Deuteronomy 33 and 27. The eternal God is your refuge, and underneath are the everlasting arms. He will thrust out the enemy before you, and he will say, destroy. A refuge is, of course, something that provides safety and shelter from pursuit, from trouble, or from danger. But the eternal God, He's your refuge. And I'm thankful today that we serve a God who is from the beginning. He is everlasting, and He's faithful. I have a memory of my grandfather. He had a mule, and as we would come toward his house in Paris, Texas, there's a dirt road or a gravel road that led to his house, a winding road. To me, it seemed very long. It probably wasn't more than a quarter of a mile. And I remember one day as we're coming down that road, and I was getting excited because we're getting close to Grandma's house. And his mule had gotten loose, sort of. Grandpa would take the mule and he would tie him to an old tire and wheel, and with a chain or a rope. And it didn't exactly keep him in the yard, but it slowed him down quite a bit. And that mule would start eating the grass in the ditch there, going along the side of the road. And he had made it halfway to the highway when we got there, and Grandpa had to go out there and get him. And when we secure ourselves to something that's not stable, to something that's not permanent, we secure ourselves to things that are always changing. There's going to be some instability. We might attach ourselves to the economy, to the weather, even to people, to jobs and things like that. The things that we're touching, the things that we're close by, those are the kind of things that can, they can give us trouble whenever they change, and things do change. And if we compare our success to someone else's success, we're sure to come up short at some point because we don't know the full story of everyone's life and why they are where they are. And we can't make a fair assessment of somebody by just glancing at them. You don't know where they are in God's timeline. When we base our happiness on earthly gains, we'll soon lose those gains when they turn to losses. And because life fluctuates, it's full of changes. And when we gauge our peace simply by the lack of trouble or conflict, we're sure to be troubled when the conflict arises again. And peace is not peace, when it's based on a nice day. And we can say, well, we have peace today because I've heard no bad news. But when you're anchored to the eternal God, to the everlasting God, and you're looking beyond this world into the one that is to come, then you know the peace that passes your understanding. It's peace that goes beyond this existence and into the realm of the Almighty and eternal God. I want to read in 2 Kings chapter 6, verse 8. It begins, now the king of Syria was making war against Israel, and he consulted with his servants, saying, my camp will be in such and such a place. And the man of God sent to the king of Israel, saying, beware that you don't pass this place, for the Syrians are coming down there. Then the king of Israel sent someone to that place of which the man of God told him. And thus he warned him, and he was watchful there, not just once or twice. Therefore the heart of the king of Syria was greatly troubled by this thing. And he called his servants. He said to them, will you not show me which of us is for the king of Israel? Somebody's leaking him information, he felt. And one of his servants says, none, my lord, O king, but Elisha the prophet who is in Israel tells the king of Israel the words that you speak in your bedroom. So he said, go and see where he is, that I may send and get him. And it was told him, saying, surely he's in Dothan. Therefore he sent horses and chariots and a great army there. And they came by night, and they surrounded the city. And when the servant of the man of God arose early and went out, there was an army surrounding the city with horses and chariots. And his servant said to him, alas, master, what shall we do? So the servant of Elisha wakes up, walks outside, and they are surrounded by people. And he's disturbed by this. And he says, Master, what are we going to do? So he answered, he said, do not fear, for those who are with us are more than those that be with them. And Elisha prayed and said, Lord, I pray. Now, this is a very unique prayer. He wasn't praying for himself. He was praying for his servant. He said, I pray, open the eyes that he may see. Then the Lord opened the eyes of the young man, and he saw, and behold, the mountain was full of horses and chariots of fire all around Elisha. So when the Syrians came down to him, Elisha prayed to the Lord and said, strike this people, I pray, with blindness. And he struck them with blindness according to the word of Elisha. And he goes on to lead the soldiers into Samaria and set a table before them and fed them. And then all they could do was go back home. But you notice that many times what we can see is determined by where we're standing. You know, what our vantage point is, perhaps what we've been going through. It could even be what mood we're in, how we're feeling. When I was about 5 years old, 5 or 6, we had thrown a table away. Well, we didn't throw it away. It had been put into the backyard until my dad could haul it to the dump. And I took that old tabletop, and there was a depression in the ground where we had pulled up an old tree that died. So there was a little bit of a hole there, and I'd pull that table on top of that hole, and I would sit in the hole with the table in front of me and the tabletop. And I pretended that table was a boat on the water. I pretended it was a car, and I was driving it. And I remember I got up and went into our car in the driveway, and I sat in the car, and I thought, well, I can just sit in the car and pretend. And it didn't have the same feeling. So I went back into the backyard, and I sat in that hole under my piece of the table. Because what happened is the difference between that table and an airplane or that table and a boat, that vast difference was all filled in with my imagination. And of course, that's how children are. They have great abilities to imagine things. And you can hear them playing with many kids, and there's no kids there because they're imaginary. And kids have that ability to do this. I had a piece of a 1x4 that had split, and there was a knot there where it had split. And it was shaped sort of like, big on one end and just kind of smaller on the other end. And that became my long rifle. And I had a play gun. I had a play rifle that you could put caps in it, and it would make, popping sounds. But something about that piece of wood, and I couldn't understand it. I just thought, I just like this piece of wood better than I do my own gun. But really, it was, as a child, our imaginations are alive. And I was reminded of that again when my children were growing up. And it would just be them playing with rope, my daughter playing with imaginary dishes. Come here, Dad, and let's drink some tea. And I remembered how vivid the imagination of a child is. And, sometimes we long for those days when we could be entertained by a room full of nothing. But that's just the imagination of a child. But Elisha was telling the Lord, open his eyes that he can see what's not there. It's actually there, but he needs to see it through the eyes of God. And while Elisha was content in the house, knowing that the Syrian army was out there, the servant couldn't see the things through God's eyes. And the servant was only seeing the earthly problem while really blind to the heavenly aspect. And, there's a transition that occurs as we get older. We kind of lose the imagination, and we don't pretend anymore. I hope we don't. But then one of the things we might fail to do is just continue shifting over into that heavenly realm where we can get back to that childlike faith, but believe in substantial help from God in those times of our trouble. We must know by faith that the unseen is really more powerful than the world that we see. The unseen is what we're living for, and that's what we're trusting in today. Psalms 23:4-5, yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil. Thou art with me. Thy rod and thy staff, they comfort me. He said, thou preparest a table before me in the presence of mine enemies. Thou anointest my head with oil. My cup runneth over. He's talking about the soul, the spirit, that interaction in the spirit realm with a very faithful and caring God. The valley that we go through where death might cast its evil shadow, it's not far enough from God for us to fear. He was there in that trouble before you ever arrived. And you know where that valley is, that death valley, where it's the death of our hopes, the death of our dreams, and they die, and our future perhaps might be crushed, and it's nothing like we had planned. But there in that valley is where the eternal part of God shows up. It goes past our current issues, and his nature, it's not defined by earthly measurements, but it's defined by God's very own will and his authority. Jeremiah 33:3, call unto me, and I will answer thee, and show thee great and mighty things, which thou knowest not. God is always about what's next. He's always about more, and he understands our limitations. And he said, I'll show you these things. No conditions, just, he said, call on me, and I'll answer. He's eternal. So there's nothing that can delay God. He's not working by earth's schedule or earth's timing. In the presence of mine enemies, think about that. That's where God decides to show up and do his work. It's kind of saying when everything is going downhill and the enemy is applauding, well, but still it doesn't matter to God. It doesn't matter where the game is. It doesn't matter how close to the finish line you are. God is going to show up because he's faithful. There's two different methods really at work here. The devil works to get you to do something now. Lose hope now. Speak negatively now. Stumble on the path. But God is working in you a far more eternal weight of glory. Think about that. The thing that stretches you out, that brings you to that place you haven't been before, or perhaps for a long time, and you haven't felt this lonely, you haven't felt this lost, the Lord is bringing you through that again so that he can stretch you out, so that he can build muscles in your faith and let you be stronger and more steadfast. God is never too late. Ezekiel preached to dry bones, and they became a great army. Too often our response is to trade earthly for earthly. And if we're trading in that's not God's economy, but we have to bring in the faith aspect. That's the heavenly part of God. That's the eternal and powerful part of God. You know, our sadness or our grief it's due to an earthly loss. But when we look past this present world, we realize that our loss was only temporary. Just temporary, because it was earthly and not heavenly. Paul said in his letter to Timothy, Demas has forsaken us, having loved this present world. He loved the present world. So when we love the present world, we're setting ourselves up for some disappointment. Hebrews 6:18 and 19, that two immutable things in which it was impossible for God to lie, we might have strong consolation, who have fled for refuge, to lay hold upon the hope that is set before us. Which hope we have as an anchor of the soul, both sure and steadfast, and which entereth into that within the veil. We can't lose our hope in that eternal and powerful aspect of a God who will always be there. But we must hold on, stand still by faith. See, our hope gets us into the eternal realm. Our hope is like throwing that rope up on the roof, getting a hold so we can climb. It gets a hold of the working of God, the healing of God, the comfort of God. Hope is our starter. If Elijah had held on to the eternal aspect from the fire that came from heaven on the mountain with Jezebel's prophets there being slain, if he could have held on to that and never let that sight out of his eyes, he may not have trembled, he may not have feared, but he was worn down in his earthly body, in his earthly mind. His emotions were very strained, and none of us could have done any better. And so that little note that he got from Jezebel crushed his world. And so just like us, he crumbled and he ran, and God strengthened him. He strengthened him for the journey. And when he got there, the Lord showed up. The same God that brought fire down from heaven, the same God that sent the rain. He found God, but he had to get to a different place. He had to get away from the part that took his hope away. We get desperate, but what we have to do is go behind the veil. See, there's that next dimension of the awesome presence of God. We go behind the veil. And when it happens, when life happens and we falter, we just go back to measuring everything by earthly standards. And it will happen to us. And we'll stare at the numbers. We'll stare at the predicament. We'll look at our deficits and say, Lord, what are we going to do? But God is still right there. He never changes. Many times it's as simple as this, just backing up and saying, Lord, I got a little too earthly for a moment and I began to measure things in an earthly measure. But Lord, help me to keep my eyes fastened on you, because you're a God that never changes. You are the everlasting and eternal God. And bind yourself to that God who never changes, and he'll bring you right out. I hope today that this helps you where you are today, or you can kind of deposit this in your memory and you can use it the next time you get into that valley and wonder, where's my God and which way do I turn? He will always be there for you.